This statement is on behalf of the Government and the Foreign Secretary, who is attending the funeral of a close family member. 10 days ago, fierce fighting broke out in Khartoum. It has since spread to Omdurman, Darfur, and other Sudanese cities. As members of this House will know, a violent power struggle is ongoing between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. Madam Deputy Speaker, the situation in Sudan is extremely grave. More than 427 people have been killed, including 5 aid workers. Over 3,700 people have been injured. Before this violence began, the humanitarian situation in Sudan was already deteriorating. We now estimate that approximately 16 million people, a third of the Sudanese population, are in need of humanitarian assistance. These numbers, I regret to inform the House, are likely to rise significantly. While the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces announced a 72-hour ceasefire from 0500 hours London time on the 21st of April to mark the holy festival of Eid, it did not hold. Given the rapidly deteriorating security situation, the government took the difficult decision to evacuate all British Embassy staff and their dependents to fulfil our duty to protect our staff as their employer. This highly complex operation was completed yesterday. The operation involved more than 1,200 personnel from 16 Air Assault Brigade, the Royal Marines and the Royal Air Force. I know the House will join me in commending the brilliant work of our colleagues in the Ministry of Defence, as well as the bravery of our service men and women for completing this operation successfully amidst extremely dangerous circumstances. I also want to pay tribute to our international partners for their ongoing cooperation in aligning our rescue responses. And I want to express my admiration for the work of the Crisis Centre in the Foreign Office, where over 200 officials are working 24/7 and seamlessly across government to coordinate the UK response. Madam Deputy Speaker, the safety and security of British nationals continues to be our utmost priority. Our ability to support British nationals has not been impacted by the relocation of British Embassy staff. The evacuation team will continue to operate from a neighbouring country alongside the Foreign Office in London, which is working throughout the day and night to support British nationals and push for a ceasefire in Sudan. We are asking all British nationals in Sudan to register their presence with us. The roughly 2,000 British nationals registered with us already are being sent, sometimes with great difficulty, at least daily updates by text and email. This step helps enable us to remain in contact with them whilst we find a safe passage from Sudan. Movement around the capital remains extremely dangerous, and no evacuation option comes without grave risk to life. Khartoum Airport is out of action, energy supplies are disrupted, food and water are becoming increasingly scarce, internet and telephone networks are becoming difficult to access. We continue to advise all British nationals in Sudan to stay indoors wherever possible. We recognise circumstances will vary in different locations across Sudan, so we are now asking British nationals to exercise their own judgment about their circumstances, including whether to relocate, but they do so at their own risk. Ending the violence, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the single most important action we can take to guarantee the safety of British nationals and everyone in Sudan. The Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Secretary of State for Defence and I have been in continuous contact with allies and with key regional partners since the outbreak of violence to agree a joint approach to both evacuation and de-escalation of violence. Over the weekend, the Prime Minister spoke to his counterparts, including Egyptian President Sisi and the President of Djibouti. The Foreign Secretary was in contact with the Kenyan President, the US Secretary of State, and foreign ministers of France, Germany, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Djibouti, Sweden, Turkey, Cyprus, and the EU High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy. The Defence Secretary engaged with counterparts in Djibouti, the US, France, and Egypt. I have spoken to the African Union and the Prime Minister in exile of Sudan, upon whom so many hopes rested. Further escalation of this conflict, particularly if it spills over into neighbouring countries, would be disastrous. As we continue to make clear, there must be a genuine and lasting ceasefire. Madam Deputy Speaker, we undertake to keep the House informed as the situation develops. Today, all MPs will receive a second Dear Colleague letter from the Foreign Secretary and myself. This will hopefully help to answer a number of frequently asked questions to assist honourable and right honourable members in supporting their constituents. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will continue to be in close contact with the House and provide updates wherever possible in the coming days. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Lynn Brown.
I'm very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement and for keeping me informed over this weekend. My right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, is returning from Kenya this evening, and he continues to discuss developments with African leaders there. So first, can I join the Minister in paying tribute to the bravery and professionalism of our armed forces involved in the operation to evacuate British diplomats and their families from Sudan. On behalf of Labour, I'd like to thank the 1,200 UK personnel involved in this very difficult mission, including those from 16 Assault Brigade, the Royal Marines and the RAF. Yet our relief at the success of this mission doesn't alleviate our concern for the several thousand British nationals still trapped in Sudan amid growing violence. And many will be frightened and desperate to leave, but uncertain of their next move or or the assistance that this government will be able to offer them. What they need to hear is a clear plan on how the government will support those still in danger, how they will communicate with them and when. And while we maintain the unified international pressure for a permanent ceasefire, we are clear the government should be evacuating as many British nationals as possible, as quickly as possible. None of us are in any doubt as to the complexity of the task or the difficulty of the situation on the ground. Yet we know our partner countries have evacuated significant numbers of their nationals already. 700 by France and Germany, 500 by Indonesia, 350 by Jordan, 150 each by Italy and Saudi Arabia, 100 by Spain. Yep. African partners, including Nigeria, Ghana and Kenya, are planning action too. And France included UK nationals in its airlift. We thank them. But it raises some really serious questions. Can the Minister address why partner countries have been able to evacuate sizable numbers of their nationals so far, as well as diplomats and dependents, but the UK has not? Can he confirm if the government has evacuated any UK nationals who are not employees of the embassy or their dependents? Can he confirm how many UK nationals have been evacuated by our international partners? Were the embassy staff able to complete a full and proper shutdown, including dealing with any sensitive material? And given the communications difficulties, how can we effectively coordinate a second phase of the evacuation? Naturally, questions will be asked about whether the government has learned the lessons of the chaotic Afghanistan withdrawal. We need to understand why the international community and the UK government, as Security Council penholder, was seemingly flat-footed by a conflict that, as we know, was a clear and recognised risk. Can the government give us a current assessment of Wagner's role in supporting the RSF? But the immediate priority must be to make our nationals a way to escape violence that is not their making. And we should remember also that this conflict is not the making of the Sudanese people either. Responsibility for that squarely lies with a few generals putting personal interests and ambition above the lives of fellow citizens. The resistance committees are organising mutual aid despite terrible risks. People fleeing Khartoum by road are being sheltered and supported in the villages they pass. People who only want peace, justice and democracy are showing again their solidarity and their extraordinary resilience. So can I ask the Minister to detail the steps that the UK will be taking with partners to address the looming humanitarian crisis this conflict is driving? The international community, including all of our partners, need to send a clear and united message. The generals cannot secure any future that they would want through violence. The fighting needs to stop, and it needs to stop now.
Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady very much for her comments, and in particular what she said about the work of the armed forces. She is entirely right about both the bravery and the incredible difficulty with which they executed this operation so well. She asked me about the British nationals who are trapped in Khartoum and more widely in Sudan, and I can tell her that we are looking at every single possible option for extracting them. And she acknowledged that this was a very complex area. I can only say to her that it certainly was. She referred to our partner countries, and as we know, when the French were seeking to evacuate their diplomats and some people from the wider French government platform, which is what she referred to, they were shot at as they came out through the embassy gateway, and I understand that one of their special forces is gravely ill. She asked also about why it was that the UK diplomats were evacuated. That was because we believed they were in extreme danger. Fighting was going on either side of the embassy, and that is why the government took the decision that it was essential to bring them out. We have a duty to all British citizens, of course, but we have a particular duty of care to our own staff and diplomats. She asked about the destruction of material. I can tell her that there was time for all the normal procedures to be adopted in that respect. She asked about our role at the United Nations, Madam Deputy Speaker, as the pen holder there. And as she will know, we have called already a meeting. We will call further meetings as appropriate, and we are discharging our duties as the pen holder in every possible way. She asked about the comparison with Afghanistan and whether we had learnt lessons. We most certainly have learnt lessons from Afghanistan, and the position in Sudan is completely different. First of all, in Afghanistan there were troops on the ground, British troops on the ground. There are not British troops on the ground in Khartoum and Sudan. In Afghanistan the airport was open and working. The airport in Khartoum is out of action entirely. And thirdly, there was in Afghanistan a permissive environment, and so we had the permission of the Taliban to take people out. There is no such permissive environment at all in Sudan and in the capital city. And finally, she asks about the humanitarian crisis. She's right. The humanitarian workers have been shot at. 5 of them have been killed, and prudently, those involved in the humanitarian effort are withdrawing their people. This is a total and absolute nightmare of a crisis where 16 million people are already short of food and support, and it will only get worse, as she implied in her response, unless there is a ceasefire and the generals lay down their arms and ensure that their troops go back to barracks.
Chair of the Select Committee, Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I echo those comments of other parliamentarians, showing my thanks to those Foreign Office and MOD staff who evacuated our diplomats and their families. The central tenet of the contract between British nationals and their government, or indeed the nation state, is that of trust. And trust at this point is being stretched. Trust that we will evacuate them and get them to a place of safety when they are in need. Whilst I recognise the complexity, the risk, and that we have thousands of nationals when others have just hundreds, I do urge the Minister, and I recognise that there is reportedly a reconnaissance team now on the ground, and perhaps he can confirm that there's a military reconnaissance team there. I do urge my very right honourable friend to get our people home, because that is what the Foreign Office and the MOD train our people to do. If, however, we are following the US policy of non-evacuation or limited evacuation, we must have the moral courage to tell our British nationals that that is the case, because they are running out of food, they are running out of water, electricity and internet signal. Some are killing their pets because they know they can no longer feed them. We have a duty to empower them with the information that they can have to make the right decision for them and their families. But I would urge the Minister, time is running out. We need to do the evacuation now.
Minister.
Well, I thank the Chair of the Select Committee very much for her comments. And I thank her also for her thanks to the Crisis Centre, which is working night and day. I can assure her that while the United States have made clear that they were taking out their diplomats in the early operation, which both they and we conducted, they have made clear that they're not, as things stand, planning to take out any of their citizens. We have not made that clear. Indeed, we have made clear that we are working at all levels to try and ensure that we can. We are looking at every single conceivable option, and we will do, as she suggests, everything we possibly can to help in every way we can.
Dave Dugan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's very welcome to have our civil servants evacuated, and all credit goes to the men and women in uniform who delivered that operation. The political decision to evacuate an embassy in these circumstances should be neither complex nor lengthy, so the government may wish to cease congratulating itself on that, especially as, in terms of deploying our military professionals to support ordinary citizens trapped in Sudan, the UK is trailing as usual, just as it did at the start of the COVID crisis when other nations stepped up to repatriate their people, as is expected in such circumstances. The UK dithered and mithered. Can the Minister explain to the House the root cause of this unfathomable inertia? Is this a tension between the Foreign Office and the MOD? And if so, is the Foreign Office saying go and the MOD is saying no? Or is it the other way around? Ceasefire is the answer to this crisis, the official UK government advice. Well, what comfort that to the thousands of UK nationals still on the ground? You might as well tell them, Madam Deputy Speaker, to hold their breath while they wait for food and water to run out. Meanwhile, this weekend, France evacuated 388 citizens, including Dutch, Germany airlifted 101 to Jordan, Italy and Spain have evacuated their citizens and those of Argentina, Colombia, Portugal, Poland, Mexico, Venezuela and Sudan. Turkey, 640 people, including people from Azerbaijan, Japan, China, Mexico and Yemen. And Ireland, Madam Deputy Speaker, without a tactical airlifter to its name, has evacuated its Irish nationals and is evacuating 140 more today. What it is to have friends in the world. On Radio 4 this morning, the Minister said that UK nationals in Sudan will be frustrated. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, they're terrified. They're not frustrated. He also said no fewer than 3 times that if UK nationals choose to independently flee, they will do so at their own risk, which rather exposes Foreign Office priorities in this crisis. In closing, the risk assessment taken by ministers, which advises UK nationals to stay put, did this factor in any assessment of access to food and water, failing sanitation or escalating violence, making future evacuations all the more hard?
Mr.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't agree with the early part of his comments, and it was because diplomats were specifically being targeted. He will have seen that the European Union representative was held up at gunpoint, and I have already mentioned that the British Embassy was caught between the two sides in this. Extremely dangerous, and I repeated what had happened for the French. It was a decision that our diplomats were in extreme jeopardy that led to the operation which I have described. He will know, as I said earlier, that we have of course we have a duty of care to all our citizens, and that is why we are doing everything possible, within the art of the possible, to bring them home. But we have a specific duty of care to our staff and our diplomats, and because of the extreme danger they were in, that was why the Prime Minister took the decision to launch the operation, which fortunately was so successful.
Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I also welcome this statement and pay tribute to our military in executing this evacuation for our embassy personnel. But as has been said, that duty of care must now extend to British passport holders who are still caught up in Sudan, including my constituent, Rita Abdelrahman, who went to visit her father and is now caught up in what's going on. I'm grateful for the communication over the weekend with the Minister. But I hope he recognised that whilst Khartoum, the capital, is very much dangerous, the vast country, the rest of it, is desolate. And adds together the elite forces of the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Sweden. That's a formidable elite force that could mimic what the United Nations is doing in using and protecting a land corridor to get the thousands of expats and internationals from the capital, indeed, to Port Sudan and to safety. When he's considering options, would he consider that as a possibility? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, my right honourable friend is a distinguished former soldier, and he understands the difficulties which we face on the ground. I can tell him that there's no reason to regard any of Sudan as unsafe. He will have seen what is happening, for example, in Darfur, where the RSF is a successor body to the Janjaweed, who wrought such havoc in what President George Bush described as a genocide at the time. But he will understand, therefore, that in terms of speaking about safety, that is not an easy concept to advance. But what I can tell him is that the option which he mentioned, and every option, is being very carefully considered, and we will resolve those options and move on them just as soon as we possibly can.
Sir Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I too, of course, congratulate our armed forces who've done an amazing job so far and commend the work of our diplomats. But I too add my voice to those who want to see as many of the people. He's already referred to a number of 2,000 British citizens. Does he think it's more like 4,000? Those are other numbers that have been used elsewhere. What's the best figure he can put on it? And can I just urge him, my memory of the Afghanistan situation was the way MPs had to relate to ministers was a complete and utter shambles. And some of us in particular on this side of the House felt that we had a very difficult time trying to get any proper advice for our constituents. Will he make sure that in this second letter that is meant to be coming to all of us, that there is a clearly identifiable number that we can ring, an email address that we can send things to, and we're not going off to lots of different departments of government, which ends up just being a complete and utter mess for everybody?
Minister.
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his comments. He asked me really two questions. The number of people who have replied to the Foreign Office's request for information and registered themselves is of the order of 2,000. There are public speculation that there's about 4,000 British nationals. That is, of course, British nationals and dual nationals, because if you have a British passport, you are effectively in the same category. So those are the figures. And I know that he will accept me saying that lessons have indeed been learnt from what happened in Afghanistan. The second dear colleague letter, which is, I hope, in his inbox, but if it's not, it will very shortly be in his inbox, does indeed say exactly how to get hold of the Foreign Office, and we hope that the word shambles will not be applied to the work that we are doing seamlessly across government to make sure that we achieve the aims that are common across the whole House.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you. Can I thank all those at the FCDO, the MOD and our armed forces. I've visited Khartoum, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I can absolutely understand how difficult and dangerous any evacuation is and could be. The violent fighting was started by General Hemeti's RSF. It's really worrying, especially when you consider the RSF's historic links with Wagner. I've also met General Hemeti, and I will never forget this overwhelming sense of evil. The longer the violence continues, the more people will face acute shortages of food and water, which could then perpetrate even more violence. So can my right honourable friend tell us on whether any food is actually getting into Khartoum?
Minister.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend very much for her comments, and she knows Sudan extremely well, and the whole House will have heard what she said about General Hemeti. In terms of food, she is right to fasten on the fact that the amount of humanitarian relief that is getting in, enormously needed, but because the humanitarian workers have been attacked, 5 of them have been murdered, it makes the whole issue of supply extremely difficult. And as of now, there is very little food getting into Khartoum. We are acutely aware of this, and it is yet another reason why we are pressing with our international partners, our regional friends and partners, through the United Nations and its agencies, for an urgent ceasefire that holds. None of the ceasefires so far have an urgent ceasefire, so that the humanitarian, as well as all the other issues, can be addressed.
Brendan O'Hara.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my constituent Jennifer McClellan and her 4 young children, aged between 2 and 15, are currently hiding in Khartoum. Yesterday, Jennifer reported a significant lull in the fighting, just at the time when other foreign nationals were being airlifted out of the city by their governments. And she wants to know, was that lull in the fighting coincidental, or has the UK missed a critical window in which to get its nationals out? And in the last couple of hours, she's been back in touch, having heard rumours that the Royal Navy could be heading to Port Sudan. And she wants to know if those rumours are true. But in the absence of consular staff, how will she and her family and others be evacuated from Khartoum to Port Sudan?
Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I cannot comment on rumours about the Royal Navy and Port Sudan. Obviously, his constituent and her family should make sure that they are registered with the Foreign Office. We will keep in touch in everywhere. Everyone should be receiving at least one communication per day, but I'm advised that today the internet has only been 2% available, so there are real issues with that, but we will do everything we can. He talks about a lull in the fighting yesterday. The Turks had a convoy with 3 muster points. And when they were seeking to congregate their people there, 2 of those muster points were shot up. So it is extremely dangerous, and it would not be possible to say at any point, yesterday or indeed in any of the days since this awful event took place, that Khartoum was in any way safe.
Sir James Duddridge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst it's always a very tricky decision to take as to whether to evacuate staff, and I always felt the Foreign Office were a little too keen to evacuate staff rather than protect British citizens, it's been raised that the EU embassy was shot at and is directly opposite the UK compound. So I think it does show really clear present danger to the embassy. But my question is this, and it follows a question from the Honourable Member for Rhondda. Will the Minister of State be more specific around numbers? Be more specific on the 2,000 number, how many dual nationals, how many mono-nationals, and whilst we'll treat the dual nationals equally, will the Sudanese government treat dual nationals similarly? And indeed, how many of those numbers actually want to stay? Because in previous situations, quite often dual nationals are safer and want to stay hunkered down with their families and second communities.
Minister.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his comments. I can assure him, having spent quite a lot of time with the men and women who are manning the crisis centre at the Foreign Office, that it would be quite wrong to suggest that their concern was for evacuating staff and not the wider public. The absolute commitment to the Foreign Office, from the Foreign Office, is to do everything we possibly can for all those who are caught in this way. Although, as I have mentioned before, we do have a special duty in respect of our own staff. He asked me to be more specific about numbers. I think I have been quite specific, but the published figure is about 400 for mono-nationals, about 4,000 for dual citizens. But he will appreciate that if you have a British passport, then you would expect to be treated in the same way, whichever group you belong to. And as for how many people want to leave Sudan, as I said, the Foreign Office has received registered communications from 2,000.
Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I associate myself with the comments made by the Minister and the Shadow Minister about the professionalism and bravery of those members of our armed forces who've been involved with this operation? I know from my own time at PGHQ that non-combatant evacuation operations can be particularly complex, so well done to everybody who's been involved. The situation on the ground, as we've heard from the Minister, is that there are 2,000 British nationals who are registered with the FCDO, potentially out of a total of 4,000. So given that Sudanese telecommunications are collapsing, can the Minister set out and say a bit more about what his department is doing to explore contact with those British nationals who do not have access either to a reliable phone signal or to the internet?
Minister.
Well, first of all, I thank the honourable and gallant gentleman for his comments, which come from very considerable experience. When I say that the published figure for those who are dual nationals is 4,000, it may be more or less than that. I'm only giving him the published figure. And in respect of how we communicate with people in very difficult circumstances, we are indeed extremely resourceful, but he himself set out the limitations for what is possible, and we work within those, but I hope creatively.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Madam Deputy Speaker, may I also congratulate our armed forces on their success thus far, but at a more strategic level, given that the removal of Bashir was key to stemming the threat of Islamist extremism in the region, what conversations has my right honourable friend had with colleagues in like-minded countries such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia to ensure that whatever the political outcome is in Sudan, it does not rekindle the threat of Islamist extremism, which would have an impact on regional security and potentially our own?
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend, the former Defence Secretary, is absolutely right in what he says, and there is a real danger of the cross-border spread of terrorism that he describes. He asked me specifically about conversations with the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I can assure him that those conversations go on at all levels of government and indeed went on over the weekend.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. When he came to the House last week, I asked him what reassurance he can give to those Sudanese nationals who are already here in the UK. And this morning I got an email from my constituent, Mohammed, who applied for asylum 16 months ago because he was being persecuted in Sudan. He is still waiting for some kind of decision from the Home Office. So can he speak to his colleagues to offer some reassurance that those who have sought sanctuary here will not be returned to a country in conflict?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her comment. I do indeed recall what she said last week. I will refer the matter to the Home Office that she has raised, but I can assure her that no one will be being sent home to Sudan at the moment.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I add my thanks to all those involved in this crisis. But last week I thought that the Minister rather swerved my question when I asked how much the Overseas Development Assistance budget had been reduced in Sudan. So I looked online and I saw that, in fact, starting at the beginning of the 21 to 22 financial year, it really had virtually disappeared. And I wondered whether the Minister, who was in the same lobby as I was when we voted on 0.7, continues to believe that spending in these fragile and conflict-afflicted countries is actually a really powerful way of preventing conflict across the region.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would never purposefully try and swerve my right honourable friend's questions, and she and I were indeed in the same lobby, and I would just point out to her that collective responsibility, as I mentioned to the House before, is not retrospective. And in respect of the funding in Sudan, she will know that the one area of the budget where there is a degree of flexibility, even in these straitened times, is in the humanitarian area. And clearly what is happening in Sudan now will inform the decisions we make in that respect.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I, on behalf of Democratic Unionists, commend our armed forces for their significant efforts in what is a most challenging and complex situation. May I invite the Minister to recognise that it may be a stretch to suggest that having no diplomatic or military footprint in Sudan at all has no effect on our ability to rescue and evacuate British citizens. But having listened to a Northern Ireland resident last Wednesday who was doing an interview ensconced in his basement with his family in Sudan, highlighting that he was having to siphon water from a tap of his neighbour's home and had little recourse to food at that point on Wednesday, how do we assure him today that he hasn't just been left alone?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I said in my... I thank him for his comments about the armed forces. As I mentioned in the statement, Madam Deputy Speaker, We do not think that our diplomatic reach is diminished in these circumstances by diplomats being withdrawn. And that is because when they were holed up in great jeopardy in Khartoum, they were not able to operate, and most of the work was being done from the crisis centre in London, and that is the position today. But I can tell him that our teams in surrounding states are moving to the point where they can help anyone who comes in across the border, and the diplomatic mission that was resident in Khartoum will be relocating shortly to a neighbouring country.
Sir Julian Lewis.
According to the Ministry of Defence, the Sudanese armed forces have been reasonably helpful on evacuation issues, but surely the best possible protection for any future evacuation would be under the auspices of the United Nations, where blue berets still count for a lot. So can my right honourable friend assure the House that the government is in the closest contact with the UN to see whether or not that extra degree of protection can be obtained for any future extraction operation?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for his comments. What I can assure him is that not only is the role of the UN under constant examination to be progressed in any way we possibly can, but that as Britain holds the pen, in the jargon of these things, at the UN on Sudan, we are leading the efforts to make sure that all these possible opportunities through the United Nations are pursued.
Karen Butt.
Deputy Speaker, with a large Sudanese community in Westminster, it's no surprise that I have a number of constituents who are currently trapped, terrified in Khartoum, at least one of whom I have to tell the Minister has told me that he has registered but has yet to hear anything from the Foreign Office. Now, I also appreciate the difficulties with the internet, and I recognise also that the Minister may not want to be too specific about what the future communications might be as the hours and days unfold. But can he tell us whether he is going to be able to advise MPs such as myself and my constituents that they will receive guidance as to how any future evacuation plans will be communicated to them, so they are not left in this interim period worried that the minute the internet goes down that they are totally abandoned?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady is entirely right about the importance of communication, and I hope that my second dear colleague letter will be of assistance to her in her office in handling these extremely difficult cases. And in terms of the communications difficulties which she cited and which I mentioned in response to another honourable member, we are looking at all possible ways of guidance being delivered, and I hope that we are extremely creative in working out ways of doing that. But she may rest assured that the full intellect and abilities of the Foreign Office are engaged in exactly that point.
Madam
Deputy Speaker, there was already a significant humanitarian issue in East Africa, which I know the government has been working to help address. This is going to significantly increase the humanitarian pressures on the region as a whole, as well as being potentially disastrous for the people of Sudan. Can the Minister set out what resources we already have in East Africa dealing with humanitarian issues, and what ability we have to scale those up to meet the inevitable challenge that will follow this dreadful conflict?
Minister.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend. He is right about the scale of the issues which face us in East Africa. There are something like 72 million people already who are in need of substantial help because of that, and what is happening in Sudan will make this infinitely worse, not least because there are already 16 million people who, before this awful crisis struck, were profoundly food insecure and in need of assistance. We would scale up when there is a ceasefire, when we're able to do so, in a way that he will understand. The United Nations agencies, who are extremely good at moving quickly to do this when the opportunity arises, will certainly come into play. Organisations like the World Food Programme, but many others too. but he will realise that the indubitable requirement is that there should be a ceasefire so that they can operate on the ground. And as I have said already, 5 humanitarian workers have been murdered during the last week.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to add my congratulations to those involved in this NEO, this non-combatant evacuation operation. And I'd like to really carry on the question a little further from the Honourable Member for West Worcestershire. The British government has supported many governments in developing countries over the years with education on the civil oversight of defence. And this includes educating senior military personnel in developing countries as part of our programme of defence diplomacy. Last year, a Liberal Democrat question served to find that no training has been provided by the MOD to counterparts in Sudan since 2020 because it would be regarded as military aid. Does he think education on the civil oversight of defence is worth categorising separately from military aid in those cases where perhaps a partner government might be considering receiving it?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes an interesting case. Of course, through the pooled funding arrangements that we have, often that sort of work with the military can take place. But I can tell him why he got the answer last year about Sudan. It was because all our efforts were bent to trying to support the peace process and the negotiations that were going on in order to achieve a return to civilian rule. Sadly, all of that is now very much on the back foot. But that is the aim. If we can get a ceasefire, that these political negotiations should start so that there can be a civilian government in Sudan.
John Redwood.
Government advise UK nationals in difficulties to stay indoors, but what if they've run out of food? What if there is no power or other water or other utilities? Or what if there is firing in the local area? What advice then, and what message of hope for them?
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend makes an extremely good point. The only advice which we can give through the Foreign Office, the only advice is to stay indoors because of all the reasons I've given during this statement about the jeopardy that is going on in the streets outside. We have changed the advice today to say that while we think people should undoubtedly remain indoors if they can, if they're not going to do so, they do it at their own risk. But they must make their decisions on the ground. And of course, there are those who know the situation around where they live extremely well and may well be able to exercise their judgment, but they do so at their own risk.
Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I also want to pay tribute to the hard-working staff at the Crisis Centre. Last night, a constituent's father who'd been shot at in Khartoum by armed militia was evacuated by the generosity of the French forces. My office has spoken to his family this morning. They are overwhelmed with grief. They mentioned that while Dad had managed to get out of the country, down to sheer luck, one of our friends remains in his apartment just 3 buildings down from where Dad was. The information trickling down from the UK government remains minimal, and the announcement of European countries evacuating citizens makes this even tougher. And given the reports that there are over 4,000 British nationals currently in Sudan facing great danger, can the Minister update us on how many FCDO staff are currently responding to this crisis and why it would appear to be that the UK has been slower in helping our citizens caught up in the grave danger?
Well, the Honourable Lady will know that we were the first, along with the Americans, to intervene in terms of any extraction whatsoever. She asks me how many civil servants are engaged, and the Crisis Centre has 200 working there. They are working on shift, but they are working throughout the night and day, every day, more or less since this started a week ago.
James Gray.
Can I ask a particular question which may have a more general application? My young constituent, aged 24, has taken refuge in a central official building in Khartoum, along, I think, with a great many others, but her passport has been locked up in her NGO building, which is now locked and sealed. Will, therefore, the Minister make sure that when any evacuation does eventually occur, some kind of official travel documents may well be available for those who don't actually have them with them?
Minister.
My honourable friend makes an important point. Obviously, it's essential that his constituent does do their best to contact the Foreign Office team so that we are able to make a note of what he says. But I thank him very much for informing us about that specific problem.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
The proposition, Madam Deputy Speaker, that war and conflict doesn't happen during high days and holy days is a ridiculous one. Therefore, due to woeful inadequate intelligence on the ground, it seems, and maybe the Minister when he gets to the dispatch box can correct me if I'm wrong, that the British British Ambassador to Sudan decided to go on holiday. Can you confirm that, and can you confirm, if that's true, who was in charge on the ground?
Well, the ambassador is entitled to return to the UK either on diplomatic business or indeed on leave if that is appropriate. But what I can tell him is that the second most senior person in the embassy in Khartoum, who was the development director there, he was indeed in post when this disaster struck.
James Wilde.
Given that there can be no guarantee of de-escalation, can my right honourable friend confirm that COBRA is meeting regularly and urgently to consider all evacuation options and will be prepared to take risk in doing so and using the strength of the UK Armed Forces if needed?
I can indeed confirm what my honourable friend asks. COBRA is meeting as we speak, Madam Deputy Speaker. It has met 6 times so far, 5 times chaired by the Prime Minister, including one COBRA that we were at 3:15 on Saturday morning.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, can I extend my thanks to the Armed Forces and also everyone involved in trying to resolve this crisis. I am still a little unclear from the Minister in terms of what he said as what the plan is. Now, I appreciate he can't provide operational details that might put people at risk, but can he at least give a step-by-step outline of what the plan is, for example, around international relations, in terms of a ceasefire, in terms of evacuation that should be being planned? Thank you.
Minister.
I thank her very much for her comments about the armed forces. She asked me what is the plan, and my answer to her is very clear. There are a very wide range of options, I hope fully comprehensive, which are being pursued with vigour on every possible opportunity and circumstance. And as soon as we are able to say more than that, we will, of course, tell the House.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I join other honourable and right honourable members in congratulating our armed forces for their very successful operation over the weekend? Madam Deputy Speaker, a significant number of NHS doctors come from Sudan, and I understand from a consultant at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in my constituency that around 50 of these doctors from various locations in the country are currently trapped in or near Khartoum. Can I thank my right honourable friend for the advice his staff at the FCDO and indeed my honourable friend the member for South West Hertfordshire provided at the weekend to me and to my constituent who works there at the earlier stage of this process. But does my right honourable friend agree that it is incumbent upon those fighting in Sudan to do all that is necessary to enable those who wish to leave to do so? It is incumbent upon them to cease fire, and it is incumbent upon them then to provide safe passage.
I thank my honourable friend for what he has said, and in particular about the doctors that he mentions. In respect of humanitarian law, the position is extremely clear, and it is clear that humanitarian law is being breached on all occasions in Sudan. So he is right to make that point. And can I also thank him for what he said about the armed forces? Just because the operation was an outstanding success, we should not forget the brave men and women who put their lives on the line, who put themselves in harm's way in order to protect the British cohort in Khartoum.
Kirsten Oswald.
Deputy Speaker. I have constituents who are trapped in Khartoum. They are NHS doctors. Their colleagues are gravely worried for them. They're stuck with 2 very small children. And I've listened carefully to what the Minister has said today, and he said that there's a grave risk to life, that food and water are scarce, that the internet is sparse, that people may wish to relocate at their own risk, but that's something that is very risky and they have to exercise their own judgment. None of these statements are of any practical help to my constituents who really need concrete support to get them and their children out of this perilously dangerous situation. So what more can he tell us about the practical efforts being made to ensure that there are food and water supplies on the ground? And what more can he tell us that our constituents can take some comfort from about the efforts being made to get people back? Because nothing that I have heard here today has given me any comfort that my constituents should hope to be back home where they belong at any time soon.
Well, I completely understand the frustration which the Honourable Lady, and in particular her constituents, will feel at these events. And I have to be absolutely frank with the House and ensure that no one is misled. The position is extremely difficult, and as I have outlined both in my statement and in my answer to questions, we operate within the art of the possible, but she may rest assured that we will do everything we can and are doing everything we can and have been doing so since the start of this crisis to ensure that her constituent gets home safely.
Tamanjit Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just as it was with the repatriation of British nationals during the COVID pandemic, it seems that once again we are well behind the curve compared to other countries, and the thousands of British nationals still stranded in Sudan will now be facing food and water shortages along with other dangers to their life. But according to media reports, it is apparent that both the ambassador and the deputy ambassador were out of Sudan as early as the 14th of April. Can the minister confirm if that is correct? And if so, why was senior leadership not present to help the British nationals in Sudan when they most needed them?
Minister.
I don't think, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is a particular comparison with the COVID pandemic. This is a very different situation. Indeed, it is very different from the situation in Afghanistan, as I explained to the House a little earlier. He outlines what he will understand as an exceedingly complex and difficult situation. On the issue of staffing, the ambassador was indeed out of the country, and the deputy head of mission was not the second most senior person in the embassy. That was the development director there, as I explained in an answer to an earlier question.
Ronnie Cowan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. To echo the remarks of the Honourable Member for East Renfrewshire, I've been contacted by a constituent of mine who is gravely concerned for family members that are stuck in Khartoum, including her great-grandchildren, the youngest of which is approaching 3 years of age. And as said in your statement, food and water are becoming increasingly scarce. So I get the complexity of the situation, but what are we doing specifically to get food and water to those people who are doing as they were requested to do and staying in their houses?
Hear, hear.
Minister.
Well, once again, I hope that the dear colleague letter will be of assistance in informing his constituents on these matters. In terms of food and water, the position is deteriorating even more because the humanitarian workers are not able to carry out their normal activities. But he will also understand that we are operating within the art of the possible, and therefore what we have to do is make sure that all options are explored as rapidly as possible so that we can bring help to those people who are caught up in the dreadful jeopardy that he so eloquently described.
Samantha Dixon.
Thank you. The Minister has very kindly set out the arrangements in the crisis centre run by the FCDO. It's clear from listening to colleagues across the benches that the FCDO and members of Parliament are going to be inundated with requests for help. So will the Minister consider stepping up and adding further support to the crisis centre, because it clearly seems to be needed?
Minister.
She is right to identify, Madam Deputy Speaker, the considerable amount of work that is being done through and by the Crisis Centre. As I mentioned earlier, working night and day, there are 200 people engaged in that work, and let me assure her unequivocally that if any more people are required, we will provide them.